And we will welcome those who are watching the recorded version of our program. Just take a minute for my setup here. So, liberation ethics. Even though I was raised as a humanist, I've often been drawn to religious thinkers whose theology I might not share, but whose vision of the human spirit and the future of humanity I resonate with. The liberation theology movement has been one of my inspirations. For those not familiar with it, I'm going to start with a little bit of the context. In the 1950s and 1960s, some Latin American theologians within the Roman Catholic Church began to center their theology on liberation. They called this a preferential option for the poor. For them, salvation involved liberation from earthly injustice. In Latin America, this meant organizing faith communities that also organized to serve the physical needs of the people: food, water, sanitation, fuel, electric power. By 1968 to 71, several key writings about liberation theology were published, and the world began to know more about it. These writings included a critique of power structures within their own countries, regimes that often exploited the poor, often using violence. These critiques also included a critique of the world economy and how the so-called developed nations became richer at the expense of poorer nations. Through the 1970s, liberation theology gained influence, especially in Latin America, and it also began to influence, for instance, Black theology in the United States. A key series of events brought more attention of the world to these ideas. In 1977, Pope Paul appointed Oscar Romero as Archbishop in El Salvador. Romero was not at the time much of a proponent of liberation theology, but he watched in his country as military rulers rounded up and killed civilians, priests, and nuns who believed that their religion demanded their opposition to that military rule. Romero began to name in his weekly sermons the individuals who the military regime was taking away, never to be seen again, the desaparecidos, the disappeared. In 1980, in the capital's Central Cathedral, in one weekly sermon, Archbishop Romero said this, addressing in specific soldiers who carried out military orders. In English, brothers, you are all killing your fellow countrymen. No soldier has to obey an immoral order. It is time to regain your conscience. In the name of God and in the name of the suffering people, I implore you, I beg you, I order you, stop the repression. The next night, Romero celebrated Mass in a small chapel for cancer patients. In his sermon, he said, he who wants to withdraw from danger will lose his life. But the person who gives himself to the service of others will be like a grain of wheat that falls to the ground and dies, but only apparently dies, for by its death, its wasting in the ground, a new harvest is made. And then, at that same service, a lone gunman assassinated Romero. Later investigation by a UN commission identified a right-wing leader in that country as ordering the assassination. But the liberation theology movement was not accepted internationally within the church that gave birth to it. In 1990, under Pope John Paul II, the Vatican moved to suppress those who endorsed liberation theology. Those bishops who retired were replaced with more conservative bishops. In more recent times, Pope Francis, himself from Latin America, has been more friendly to liberation theology, although not really a full endorser and not without a critique. Nevertheless, in 2015, he oversaw the beatification of Archbishop Oscar Romero, which is the first step towards recognizing Romero as a saint in the Roman Catholic Church. Following for years the development of a Latin American liberation theology, Many people, especially here in the United States, began to ask, what would a North American liberation theology look like? The power structures, the specifics of culture are related but different. There is still poverty, inequality, and injustice. Some groups are more marginalized. There is systemic oppression. In North America, or more broadly in the context of post-Enlightenment Western culture, what people often mean by liberation and freedom is this: I get to do whatever I want to do. Or even, I get to do anything that I can seize the resources or power to be able to do. Liberation and freedom in this sense are for me, not for we. Well, I have no doubt that the Enlightenment also influenced Western culture to gradually add more and more to the people who deserved freedom. As many, but not all, experience freedom, they want others to experience that freedom too. Western culture has pulled in both directions at the same time: me liberation and we liberation. In America, the Transcendentalist movement is a good example. Emerson, Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, they all had a commitment to the freedom of the self, of the individual. But they also saw the individual self as a more full human being than just a rational self. Self-reliance is perhaps Emerson's most read essay. It is not actually, despite that title, about being a separate individual. It is about resisting conformity for the sake of conformity. But self-reliance for Emerson was about a fullness of alignment and connection of the individual and the larger whole of reality. Self-culture, or growth of the human spirit, became for the Transcendentalists the greatest end of life. And then many of those who were part of that intellectual and liberal religious movement moved from the liberation of the individual to also become early feminists and early abolitionists. And why? Because they saw that liberation was the most natural state of every human being. And thus it was a responsibility of others to work for the liberation, not just of each of us ourselves, but for the all. That flowering of an American Enlightenment moved from me liberation to we liberation. Freedom and liberation become more real the more inclusive they are. No one is truly liberated until all are liberated. And yet in America, and more generally in the West, liberation and freedom has often been me liberation, not we liberation. The founders in America, influenced by thinkers in Europe, expressed their commitment to freedom, but it was primarily freedom for themselves, not their wives and daughters and mothers and sisters, not those without property who worked for wages, and not those who those very same founders enslaved. That kind of freedom for oneself over others has also been a strand in Western thought. In that strand, freedom or liberation is only for me, and may even require that others have less freedom. Freedom and liberation in that view become an item of scarcity. Well, I started my undergraduate college work at the University of Chicago many years ago. At that time, most of the economic department was centered around Milton Friedman. We did have Maynard Kruger there, but he was in his later years. Maynard Kruger had run as a vice presidential candidate with Norman Thomas on the Socialist Party ticket many years earlier, with the inspiring slogan, "The workers are eager for Thomas and Krieger." Well, I did not study much economics at the University of Chicago because I was so turned off by the me libertarianism of so much of that school. I remember an interview at the time with Milton Friedman. He was asked about his grandmother, his own grandmother, who arrived in America as an immigrant to become a piece worker in the garment industry, and who may have died early because of the working conditions. Milton Friedman said he was glad that she was able to make that sacrifice so that he could be where he was. And then another counterexample of American thinking. I finished up my undergraduate degree at a Catholic women's college. It was run by the kind of nuns who would picket the Pope when he was in town. Because my employer would pay for me to get my degree, I changed my major to business. And the college actually called it Women in Business. So I had to take a bookkeeping class. My bookkeeping professor was a sympathizer with liberation theology. He would periodically ask the class members of bookkeeping, what is the purpose of a business? And in responding to answers, he always critiqued what he called the Milton Friedman answer, to make a profit. No, he would say, the purpose of a business is to serve the needs of the community. A profit might be a signal that you're successfully doing that, but a profit should be a side effect, not the end or the purpose. And that was a bookkeeping professor. When I took an actual economics course as part of finishing up my degree at that college, the professor was a nun, one who had recently arrived from another college. It turned out she was a very big fan of both Milton Friedman, when the topic was the American economy, and of liberation theology and its economic radicalism when the topic was the world economy. Well, by that point in my life, I had done a lot of self-study in social and economic systems, so I knew that such a combination was incredibly ironic and actually impossible. Milton Friedman at the time explicitly supported some of the same dictators that this professor wanted overthrown in the name of liberation. Between my first and second foray into college study, I had been both working for an American corporation as my day job and committing a good part of my free time to social justice and anti-racism work. I had first read about Black liberation theology via James Cone, who taught for many years here in New York at Columbia. He was inspired by both Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. His book on the two of them remains, I think, one of the best unpackings of some of the differences between Southern and Northern racism. James Cone wrote, "The gospel of liberation is bad news to all oppressors because they have defined their freedom in terms of slavery of others." Now, as someone who was not raised in a Christian religious context, and not even in a theistic context, I had to do a lot of translating when I read Cone and other liberation theology. A gospel means good news, literally. It's a story that brings good news about human salvation. And in a humanist context for me, that meant good news about becoming fully and deeply and ethically human. So liberation is good news, but it is bad news for those who define their freedom in terms of others being less free or even enslaved. Bad news for the power structures that treat freedom as a scarce commodity, where if you are free, I am somehow less free. Instead, the good news is that my own freedom is in fact more liberating if others are also liberated. For me, it was inspiring. The me is never truly liberated unless the we are also liberated. In liberation theology, oppressive social, economic, and political structures are sin. In liberation theology, sin is also actively and passively participating in oppression. In liberation theology, justice for the poor is central to what the theologian calls salvation. And as James Cone saw from the late 1960s on, Black people and other people of color are far more likely to be poor because of racism. So anti-racism is also central to a liberation theology in the USA and in Western culture. In a liberation theology context, racism is a sin. Liberation theology critiqued the view that religion is mostly about comforting people who are spiritually afflicted, and actually often about comforting those who are comfortable as well. Instead, liberation theology is about comforting the spiritually and materially afflicted. But through calling for change and for political and civic action, that will disturb those who are comfortable in their disproportionate power. Comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Challenge whether those who are materially comfortable are really spiritually righteous. Being spiritually comfortable while any are materially afflicted by our own collaboration in liberation theology is the greatest sin. And so liberation theology is also about action. Action to change the material oppressions in the world. Action is essential in liberation theology to spirituality. Action to maintain oppression or inaction which consents to the way things are. Those are seen as spiritually deadening, both to the self as well as to others. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. put it, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Well, I had to do a lot of translating of that, as did many others. Christians, Jews, theists, non-theists came together in commitment, for instance, to Black liberation in the 1950s and 1960s. In turn, the civil rights movement, and that commitment to liberation inspired the feminist movement for women's liberation and the gay rights movement for LGBTQ liberation. And all had both religious and secular motivations among those who worked for liberation. For me, the core of liberation ethics isn't that God wants this. It is that this is the world that liberates us all. My own humanism is focused on what is the way to be human in this world. And it is not limited to my being, but to all being. My humanism isn't just about me as some disconnected personality. It is about the liberation of being connected to other liberated human beings. Where some are not free, nobody is truly free. And freedom which depends on any form of enslavement of others is not truly freedom. One of the founders of Latin American liberation theology, a Roman Catholic priest, once suggested that for the Christian, liberation in fact means giving up the idea that Jesus is God and focusing on Jesus in his humanity. For me, theology isn't my context. I do not live my life centered on a transcendental being as the core of my life stance, my philosophy, even my religion, nor do I measure right and wrong by what some transcendent being wants. Instead, I center my right living. I center myself on what is right living. How do I act in this world to be the best human being that I can be? And that requires, I think, an ethics of liberation, a faith in human capacity for caring, connection, and freedom, not just for myself and my comfort, but for liberation and caring and connection of all. I have learned so much from liberation theology. Both liberation ethics and liberation theology have many common elements. Both are about action, and both start from an analysis of what stands in the way of liberation. Both refuse to see as separate the liberation of the human spirit and material liberation. Thus, both would oppose war. Both oppose poverty as a sign of failure. Both oppose inequality. Both oppose environmental destruction. War, poverty, inequality, and environmental destruction are the key means by which material oppression is experienced. All of those are oppressive to the human spirit as well as the human body. Liberation ethics, like liberation theology, needs to center on the poor and oppressed or marginalized and their needs. The Christian liberation theology expresses it this way: an appropriate parallel for the time of year in which we have Easter. They say the poor are on the cross. One cannot mourn the crucifixion of Jesus and accept the crucifixion of the poor right here and right now. Both systems, ethics and theology, critique the systems of oppression and systems that sustain that oppression. rather than simply blaming individuals who are at the heads of those systems. A liberation ethic sees even those individuals as held back from their full humanity by their participation in these systems. A liberation ethics would therefore also critique the way some nations oppress and dominate other nations. A liberation ethics, in fact, is anti-nationalism, the idea that one's own nation is better than others and deserves more power, and that the people of one's nation are superior to other people. Liberation ethics rejects the idea that a nation's greatness depends on the poverty and powerlessness of other nations. A liberation ethics, like liberation theology, is anti-violence, anti-war. It is nonviolent but not passive. A liberation ethics is active. A liberation ethics expands as our consciousness expands, accepting the liberation not just of those who are like us, but the liberation of all. And finally, while liberation theology emphasizes that spiritual wellness is crucial, care of the soul, in a liberation ethics, care of the soul, we might define that soul in more universal terms. As Audre Lorde once said, self-care can be a revolutionary act. Today, the Poor People's Campaign is an example of a multi-faith response to poverty, war, inequality, and economic devastation. This weekend is not only the anniversary of the assassination of King, but it is the anniversary of the founding of the first Poor People's Campaign, centering the poor for the liberation of all. In theological terms, oppressive social, economic, and political structures are sin, and so is actively or passively participating in those structures. In ethical language, those oppressive structures are deep violations of right relationship. Actively or passively participating in oppression is also a deep violation of right relationship. In both systems, theology and ethics, healing is an important part of social justice. Social injustice does not only produce material suffering, but it creates a kind of trauma, an emotional damage, a damage, if I dare say it, to a human spirit. For an ethical culturist, uniqueness and worth of every human being is central. And it's also central that we understand that we are infinitely interconnected to all others. Thus, we too are at the foundation committed to the welfare of every human being, not just those who are like us, not just those who have power, wealth, or social advantage. I, of course, can't help thinking today of how this relates to our current crisis. This talk and this topic were planned last fall, well before anyone could even see what would be happening this spring and what would be changing our lives and our social connections. The clarity of what is essential, though, has never been in my lifetime more obvious. The compassionate, the ethical, the right relationship, the liberation response to this crisis puts people first. Are we looking at what this crisis means just for ourselves? Or are we centering on what it means for those who already were poor or oppressed or marginalized, or maybe pushed into that by this crisis? Because of institutional racism, the death toll in our own city and in this country has a rather stark racial bias as well. Poverty and vulnerable health go together. Low-wage jobs and poverty are, of course, related. And low-wage jobs, it turns out, are a lot more valuable than the pay scale indicates. It is ironic what essential workers we now depend on. Many of them are at the lowest end of the wage scale. Obviously, how we have come to reward the value of work is not based on how much the work serves a purpose in the community. Questioning how we value and reward work is one way we need to continue when the immediate crisis is over, if we see the world through a liberation lens. What are the essential jobs to keep both human welfare and the economy functioning? We often think of the government as handling mainly infrastructure, like highways that allow human connection and commerce alike to function. Without the infrastructure of the internet right now, this current physical isolation would be a lot worse for many of us. Liberation and commerce both require infrastructure. But I would contend that infrastructure is a lot more than roads and internet. People need to be fed. They need to be healthy. They need to be educated. Liberation of all individuals depends on those. But it also turns out that commerce, our economy of specialization and interconnection in providing needs for human beings, commerce depends on these also. Food, health, education. And yet many corporations have escaped paying the taxes that have sustained such systems. Our common welfare obviously needs to center food, health, and education. They're basic to human liberation, and without them, even commerce fails. This current crisis is bad, and I don't want to talk about silver linings. I think that dismisses the very real suffering. But I also think we have the opportunity to come out of this crisis with a better sense of what serves both the me and the we, not just the me. What production is really essential? How do we value work for both individual survival and social survival? How do we value work for human and social liberation? So I invite you this week to look at all that is happening around us through a liberation ethics lens. What actions can you take, even from your own home, to increase justice more than decrease it? How does self-care and liberation concern come together for you right now? And what can you do this week under the controlled conditions we need for the safety and health of the many to contribute to a better future of liberation and freedom for all and not just for ourselves? Get some of the material here to work with technologically.
Thank you, Joan.
I want to say goodbye at this point to those who are watching the recorded version of the video. Those of you who are watching the recorded version can find more videos from us and more about us at rysec.org or at our Facebook page for the Riverdale Yonkers Society for Ethical Culture. And come join us some Sunday morning.